There is something strange happening around Christopher Nolan's next film. Not because it's based on one of the oldest stories ever written, not because it's reportedly one of the most ambitious productions ever attempted, but because for the first time in a long time, I think Nolan might actually be vulnerable. Now, before everyone rushes to the comments, this isn't me saying the Odyssey is definitely going to be bad. It could end up being a masterpiece. In fact, I really hope it is. Nolan has earned enough goodwill over the years that writing him off completely would be absolutely ridiculous. But looking at everything we know so far, I genuinely think this has the potential to be his first film in a very long time that fails to live up to the impossible expectations surrounding it. And I think there are a few reasons why. Let's start with the obvious. The Odyssey isn't an original Nolan concept. It is one of the most famous stories in human history. For nearly 3,000 years, Homer's Odyssey has been retold, adapted, reimagined and referenced across almost every form of media imaginable. Most people don't know every detail, but almost everyone recognises at least parts of it. The Cyclops, the Sirens, the Trojan Horse, it's part of our cultural collective imagination, at least in the West. That's both an advantage and a huge problem. One of Christopher Nolan's greatest strengths has always been taking original concepts, or at least concepts that feel fresh, and making audiences feel like they've never seen anything like them before. Take Inception or Interstellar, Memento at the top of the pile, and even Tenet, for all of its, many flaws, it was undeniably unique. But with the Odyssey, there's just nowhere to hide. Everyone already knows the story. That means audiences won't just be judging Nolan's filmmaking, they'll be comparing his version against years of expectations. Something he has tackled with Batman Begins, and to his credit, absolutely crushed. But this is another level. Then there's the money. Reports suggest the Odyssey is one of the most expensive Christopher Nolan films ever. When a movie costs this much, it has to appeal to everyone. That is movie making business. Studios do not spend hundreds of millions of dollars hoping to make a respectable profit. No, they need a global phenomenon. And that is where I think one of the film's biggest problems begins. To justify that budget, the cast is packed with some of the biggest faces in Hollywood. Huge stars, actors that instantly make audiences say, "Oh, that's," instead of seeing the character. Normally, that's fine, but the Odyssey isn't just another blockbuster. It's mythology. It's a story that has existed in people's minds for centuries. When you watch something rooted in ancient legend, there's a certain authenticity you want to feel. You want to believe these people belong in that world. But when every major character is played by Spider-Man or Jason Bourne or Catwoman, or someone whose face you've already seen in 10 other blockbuster franchises, it becomes harder to disappear into the story. Instead of seeing Odysseus, you see a movie star playing Odysseus. That's a very different experience. The bigger the budget becomes, the more famous the cast has to be. That's the rules. And ironically, that can make the world feel smaller. Christopher Nolan has always been obsessed with pushing filmmaking technology. That's amazing. Normally, it's exciting. He shoots on film, he uses practical effects whenever possible, he avoids CGI when he can, sometimes, in my opinion, to his detriment, and that's part of what makes his movies so special. But with The Odyssey, I wonder if the technology has started to overshadow the actual storytelling, because the film has been shot entirely on IMAX cameras, which sounds incredible on paper, and the image itself will look amazing up on the screen. Except those cameras are enormous. During production, the cameras were so large that special mirror systems had to be used so actors could maintain proper eye lines during scenes. Think about that for a second. Instead of the camera adapting to the performance is adapting to the camera. And I can't help wondering whether we're reaching a point where the technology itself becomes part of the problem. When audiences hear more stories about the cameras than the characters, it feels backwards. I actually think Christopher Nolan's recent films have been on a downward trajectory. Not technically, obviously, not visually. Those have arguably become even more impressive, but emotionally. Take Interstellar. For many people, that is peak Nolan. It has spectacle, yes. It also has heart. And then came Dunkirk, an incredible technical achievement, but it's one I sometimes forget he made. Then Tenet, The film built around an unbelievably weird concept which is right up my alley, but for me and many viewers it became less about engaging with the story and more about just trying to figure out what the fuck is going on. And if you didn't like it, there was always someone ready to say, oh, you just didn't understand it. And maybe that is true, but I'm not spending 4 hours googling entropy reversion. I'm not. And sometimes something is simply difficult to connect with, which is how I feel. For me, Tenet didn't connect. Sometimes audiences aren't emotionally invested because the film prioritises mechanics over character. That's a valid criticism, and that is something that he's done before. And then came Oppenheimer. And before anyone gets angry, I actually think Oppenheimer is a good film, but its box office success wasn't created in a vacuum. The Barbenheimer phenomenon became one of the biggest cultural events in movie history. Can I say that? Is that a bit too exaggerated? People who probably wouldn't have watched a 3-hour historical drama ended up buying tickets because it became an event. It was impossible to avoid. Social media exploded, the memes were everywhere, and people double featured Barbie and Oppenheimer. That lightning in a bottle moment massively inflated the box office numbers. I'm not saying Oppenheimer only succeeded because of Barbenheimer, far from it. But I do think it gave the film a level of momentum that almost no movie ever receives. The Odyssey won't have that. At least it's not looking like it. This time, the film has to stand entirely on its own. That's a much harder challenge. And an even harder challenge than that is Christopher Nolan isn't just competing against other directors anymore, he's competing against himself. Every new Nolan film arrives with impossible expectations. People expect a masterpiece before they've even seen a trailer. That is dangerous because eventually every filmmaker reaches a point where expectations become impossible to satisfy. So I am worried. I hope The Odyssey will be incredible. Maybe it will redefine epic filmmaking in a way which we don't expect. If it's merely good, people may still see it as a disappointment. That's the curse of becoming one of the biggest directors alive. I genuinely hope I'm wrong. Seriously, the film industry needs directors willing to take huge creative swings. And Christopher Nolan is one of the few filmmakers who can convince studios to spend enormous amounts of money on an original artistic vision. Or at least, ambitious interpretations of classic stories. Is that better? That is worth celebrating, but ambition alone doesn't guarantee greatness. A massive budget can become a burden. An all-star cast can break immersion. Cutting-edge technology can distract from the story it's supposed to serve. And when you're adapting one of the most famous tales ever written, audiences already have decades of expectations before they even buy a ticket. For the first time in a long time, Christopher Nolan doesn't have mystery on his side. He doesn't have a high concept, original premise to surprise us with. He doesn't have the momentum of Barbenheimer. He has one of the oldest stories ever told and a shitload of money to tell it. Now he has to convince us his version is the one we need. Maybe he will. I hope he will. Or maybe, for the first time in years, Christopher Nolan will discover that even the greatest directors aren't immune to failure. And honestly, that is what makes The Odyssey one of the most fascinating films to watch. Not because it could be Nolan's greatest achievement, and again I stress, I hope it is, but because it could finally test whether his reputation is truly untouchable.